And welcome in everybody to another edition of the College Hoop News Podcast. As usual, I am your host, Tony Patelis. We have another conference preview edition tonight. We're going to be talking about the Missouri Valley. Joining me tonight is Josh Betts from betsportsbeat.com. You can find him on Twitter at betsportsbeat. He's very knowledgeable when it comes to the MVC, so really glad to have him to come on tonight to talk about the league. Josh, how are you tonight, my friend?
Doing well, Tony. I appreciate the invitation to join you. And just on a personal note as well, keep up the great work that you're doing. It's always very enjoyable.
Thank you very much. So, before we get into our team previews, Josh, I just wanted to quickly get your outlook on the league this year. So, obviously, I think there's a lot of hype surrounding the MVC this year. Obviously, you have Loyola making that great Final Four run last year. I think the top of the league has a chance to be really, really good. Illinois State is really talented. I think Southern Illinois is a team that's kind of getting overlooked because of Loyola and Illinois State. We're going to talk about them later. And I think teams like Indiana State and Valpo could possibly creep up the standings this year. I think the MVC would like to get back to the level they were a few years ago when they had teams like Creighton and Wichita State. And possibly it could be this year. You never know. Maybe they could get multi bids. Probably still lean towards one, but you never know with the talent they have at the top. What's your overall outlook on the conference this year?
Well, just a few points I would make on that. You talked about um, Loyola and Illinois State, Southern Illinois. I think one of the key stories with the league this season is when you look at the preseason poll and you start looking at the teams on paper, the state of Illinois really is the strength of this league, at least in the preseason conversation. Loyola, Illinois State, Southern Illinois, and Bradley being the top four in that order in the preseason poll. I agree with what you mentioned. Teams like Indiana State and Valpo, an important season for them. I think that those teams can certainly take a step forward. Um, and to me, it's always interesting. You mentioned the Final Four run. Of course, Loyola had very well documented nationally and certainly within the league circles. It'll be very interesting to me to see how that elevates kind of the overall profile of the league, or if it elevates the overall profile of the league heading into this season. You mentioned the buzzer on the league, no question. I think the buzz is a little bit stronger than it typically would be for a number of reasons heading into this season, but certainly aided by the Final Four run by the Ramblers last season. Um, Another thing, looking at the overall outlook on the league, what does future non-conference scheduling look like for the league? I'm sure you're well aware, and other college basketball fans may be aware. This year marks the final year of the Mountain West Missouri Valley Conference Challenge that
Right.
ends following this season. And so, when we talk about future non-conference scheduling, to me, I think it's very important, and I think the Valley will be looking to restart another challenge type series or two. And and while I haven't while I haven't spoken to Missouri Valley Conference Commissioner Doug Elgin as of yet, prior to the start of the season, I would imagine that's something that he and his fellow staff members, associate commissioners, I would imagine that's something they've already began the process of looking into as far as and some additional challenge series for next season and beyond. When I
Absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. Keep going, Josh.
when I think about, personally, what I would like to see the Valley do in terms of challenges series going forward, the two leagues I look at that I think would be perfect matches when it comes to a challenge type series, the Atlantic 10 and Conference USA. To me, if the Missouri Valley Conference could start a challenge series with one or both of those leagues, I think that's two marquee non-conference games that each team, could look at going into their schedule for future seasons if those challenges would be set up. And then one other observation with regard to that, um, when you talk about the Valley, and frankly, I think other mid-major leagues um, could say this as well. I think what you'll end up with in a lot of these mid-major leagues is teams playing more neutral site and road games in order to get the quality opponents. I'm also
Sure.
interested. I'm also interested to see with the new NET metric, how does that affect mid-major leagues, whether it be positively or negatively? One other point when you talk about the overall outlook on the league, and this stat to me is I think part of why the buzz is what it is with the league going into this season. Among the 10 teams, 28 of 50 starters from last season in the Valley return. Southern Illinois returning all five, notably, and Illinois State and Bradley returning four starters apiece.
Yeah, absolutely. The league is very strong at the top, as I said in my overall outlook to start the podcast. And I think you made a good point, Josh. I think these conference challenges, the A10, the Mountain West, and the Missouri Valley, as you said, is ending, and that would be great because we know these mid-major schools have a really difficult time scheduling. A lot of the high major schools try to kind of stay away from those clubs that they could possibly lose to even on a neutral floor, sometimes it's hard to match up. I know Porter Moser talked about it quite a bit this offseason, how he had a difficult time scheduling, and I feel like a team like Loyola will play anybody at any time, any day. So hopefully they can match up with another conference maybe next year and start to get some quality opponents in the non-conference.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised, or maybe not this next season, but in the future, could there be two conference challenges as part of the
Right.
non-conference schedule? With the way that scheduling is going for mid majors, if Missouri Valley Commissioner Doug Elgin can get a couple of leagues, whether it be starting a new one for next year and another one a year or two down the road, but to have two conference challenges set up, to me, there's only positives that come out of that.
Right. Yeah, and they need to get creative, and that's exactly what they should do is try to, sneak a couple of these conferences in and do these challenges, which I really enjoy. I like to see teams match up, especially high level mid major teams match up and play as we had last year. This year I think Nevada and Loyola are matching up. That's going to be a rematch from the tournament, so that should be great. So that's pretty much our outlook on the league. We're going to get into our team previews as we usually do. We're going to go in alphabetical order. Also, I will share myself and Josh's projections, our preseason rankings, when I post the podcast later on Twitter. So look out for that. So first up tonight, we have Bradley coming off a really, I think, successful year, 20-13. They finished 9-9 in conference. I think Brian Wardell really seems to have this program heading in the right direction, Josh. They've improved each year he's been there. This past season, as I said, they win 20 games. They pretty much bring back their whole team, I think, minus Dante Thomas. So I think you're going to see a possibly top 3 or 4 finish this year. They're an excellent defensive club, one of the better teams in the country on that end of the floor. Offensively, if you look at the numbers from last year, they look pretty bad. But I think a lot of that has to do with kind of their pace of play. But they definitely need to improve, especially on that end of the floor, and especially in the efficiency department. How are you feeling about the Braves coming into the season?
Well, you mentioned it, Tony. A team last year in Bradley that really did take a step forward, and this year again feels like another year where another step forward can take place. So you mentioned the 20-13 record last season, and the Braves were one of just 4 schools to improve their record by at least 5 wins each of the last 2 seasons. Their season culminated with an appearance in the semifinals of Arch Madness, and that semifinal appearance in Arch Madness last season was the first time they had reached the conference tournament semifinals since 2010. And so a couple of indicators right there that certainly help kind of show or prove the point that last season was certainly in some respects a step forward for the Braves. Four starters returned from last season. Darrell Brown, who averaged 13.5 points per game last season. Koch Barr, their post player, averaged 4.6 points per game last season. Dwayne Lotier Ogunleye, 7.6 points per game last season. And Nate Cannell, who averaged 9.2 points per game last season. Along with those four starters, the Braves also returned their second leading three-point shooter from last season in Luc Von Bray, who was 21 of 50 from three, shooting 42%. In addition to Koch Barr returning, the Braves also added some frontline depth heading into this season in 7'1" true freshman Ari Boya. Boya will miss some time at the start of the season here due to an injury. A timeline that was announced a couple weeks ago on his injury was about a 10 to 12 week recovery. So expect him back at some point during the course of the season. To me, the biggest key for Bradley, they have a lot of experienced returnees back. I mentioned Nate Cannell and Luc Von Bray. Also, Jaden Hodgson is a returnee that has some experience along with, of course, that starting group. To me, for Bradley, you mentioned, looking to improve offensively, kind of being a key for them. I look at Darrell Brown, maybe he takes a step forward offensively. But to me, it's the guys like Nate Cannell, Jaden Hodgson, and Luc Von Bray, where I think it becomes important for those guys that tend to play a little bit more off the bench. If they can increase their scoring output this season, I certainly think that helps the Braves. But I really like the direction that Brian Wardle has his team going, and I think this year will certainly mark another step forward for them. And I look for them to finish in the top four in the league race.
Yeah, I do too. And before we move on, Josh, I wanted to ask you. I love this team's depth, and I like they have strong point guard play. You mentioned Darrell Brown. The one kid I wanted to ask you about though is Elijah Childs, who had a solid year last year, averaged 8.5, also 6.2 rebounds per game. With Dante Thomas out of the picture, one of the better front court players in the conference last year. Do you think he slides in and maybe can take over for that spot, or how do you feel Childs will work out this year?
Yeah, you mentioned Elijah Childs, a player that he really improved as the year went on, and especially in the second half of the season and in Valley play specifically. Really, you could tell he really started to kind of come into his own in that system, and really took some steps forward, um, especially in the second half of conference play last season, and really throughout league play. Um, does he slide in and fill the scoring production left by Dante Thomas? It's certainly possible, but yes, he's another key returnee amongst the other group of returnees that I mentioned. Um, does he equal the scoring output of Dante Thomas in terms of when you talk about points per game? He certainly could. And again, I think that's another key contributor and another guy that I think is really in a position to take another step forward. And he could certainly cause some headaches for opposing coaches and opposing defenses this year. But yes, you're absolutely right. Elijah Child is another key returnee for the Braves as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very excited about this team. I think they can definitely do some damage in the conference this year. So, okay, moving on here, we're going to talk about Drake next. Drake finished 17-17 last year. They were 10-8 in conference. So, Drake had some really nice momentum last year. 2 years ago, they finished ninth in the conference. They won a total of 7 games on the season. And as last year, as I said earlier, they won 17 ball games. They finished third overall. That's the good news. The bad news is they lose their excellent young head coach in Nico Medved. He's now at Colorado State. Darren DeVries comes in, former Creighton assistant. He's probably going to have his work cut out for him this season. The Bulldogs, I believe, return one starter and Nick Beglin. They do have some solid JUCO transfers who are actually, I think they're twins coming in, Trammell and Anthony Murphy. Both of those guys should probably see significant minutes. But other than that, there just seems to be a lot of question marks on this team, Josh. How are you feeling about the Bulldogs this year?
10 new players on the roster this season for Drake. You mentioned the Bulldogs' new head coach, Darren DeVries. His first time as a head coach, however, Darren DeVries, a coach who is not a stranger to the Missouri Valley Conference. You mentioned his time at Creighton as an assistant. A large portion of that when Creighton was in the Missouri Valley Conference. DeVries played his college basketball at UNI. He's an Iowa native. Uh, again, knows the Valley very well. From what I'm told, actually had applied when the position was open a couple previous times and did not get it. In fact, I think that was even acknowledged, if I recall. Coach DeVries actually mentioned that in his introductory press conference at Drake, if I recall as well. So certainly a coach with 10 new players in the roster this season. I think this season is certainly a work in progress, but DeVries is a coach that I think, being an Iowa native, is really committed to Drake. I think knows the Valley well, and I think a guy that that I feel like wants to stay at Drake and really build this into a program. I think you look at a, if I remember right, it's approximately a 20-year run as an assistant coach at Creighton. This is not a coach that has shown that he likes to, um, change, change where he's coaching every 4 or 5 years. This is a guy that has shown he likes to stay with programs and be a part of building programs. And I certainly think, in this case with Coach DeVries at Drake, I think we'll see the same thing. You mentioned, Tony, the one starter, the Bulldogs returning Nick McGlynn, senior Nick McGlynn. I mentioned the 10 new players on the roster this season. You mentioned the Murphy twins, the junior college transfers. A couple other players here, Tony, to keep an eye on, I think, for Drake. The Bulldogs add 2 graduate transfers, and Nick Norton, a graduate transfer from UAB,
Yeah.
and Brady Ellingson, a graduate transfer from Iowa. That's 2 players that I think come in right away and make, I think, a pretty sizable impact for Drake this
Oh,
season.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Another player I think that plays an important role for Drake, sophomore Noah Thomas, saw a fair amount of playing time last year as a true freshman. I think with him returning, he is the Bulldogs' leading returning scorer. He averaged just 3.6 points per game last season. I think that's a player that you look to take a step forward for Drake as well. And I think when you look at Noah Thomas coming back, Norton and Ellingson, the two graduate transfers, I'm with you. I think the Murphy twins, the JUCO transfers, see some playing time. Certainly, I think a bit of kind of a reloading year for Darren DeVries at Drake.
Sure.
But again, this is a program with Coach DeVries at the helm. I think in 2 or 3 years, this is a Drake program that I don't think there's any question that we could see back in the top half of the Valley.
Yeah, I'm with you. I definitely think it's going to be somewhat of a transition year. They're probably going to finish towards the bottom of the conference, but I think bringing in guys like Norton, guys like Ellingson, those veteran presences is going to be key. Norton has been a very, very good player in Conference USA for a few years. He does have some injury history, so hopefully he can stay healthy this year. Ellingson, pretty good shooter, I believe, at Iowa. So those are some nice pieces. I mean, those are some really quality transfers to bring in. And I'm sure they're going to probably be in that starting lineup on opening night.
Yeah, I look for Norton and Ellingson. If you're asking me to kind of first guess it, yeah, I think Norton and Ellingson are in the starting lineup on opening night, and I would add the sophomore Noah Thomas to that list as well. Just if I'm making a prediction on what part of Drake's starting 5 might look like.
All right. All right, so moving on here, we are going to be talking about Evansville next. The Aces finished 17 and 15 last year. They were 7 and 11 in the MVC. So Evansville is another team in the MVC with a new coaching staff. Walter McCarty is the new head man for the Aces, and like Drake, as we just talked about, it's probably going to be somewhat of a rebuilding year. Ryan Taylor, one of their best player, transferred. Drew Smith did as well. So the leading returning scorer is KJ Riley, I believe, who was at 6.8 points per game last year. The one kid I'm pretty intrigued with, though, on this roster, Josh, is Shea Feehan. He's a D3 transfer. Now, obviously, going from D3 to D1 is a huge jump, but I mean, the kid averaged 30 points a game at Eureka College. I believe they went to the D3 Final Four. So he's definitely somebody I'm going to be watching early on this season. But outside of that, kind of like plenty of kind of low level reserves coming back from last year's team. A few other newcomers. I know DeAndre Williams is someone they're excited about. He's a 6'9" kid out of Houston. What are you thinking about with the Aces this year? Is it going to be a rough season in Walter McCarty's first year?
Again, similar to Drake, I think a bit of a transition year, I think would be fair to say when you talk about the Aces this season. Certainly, one positive, I think, for the Aces bringing in Walter McCarty as their head coach. Walter McCarty is Walter McCarty is an Evansville native, grew up in Evansville, and so I think I think it's very evident to me just um, reading things in the preseason and those things. I know their season ticket sales are way up this
Right.
year, and so I think the excitement level I think is on the increase in Evansville with Walter McCarty's arrival, and so I think that's certainly positive. Anytime the community gets behind a team, I think that's only a positive, and only
Yeah.
positives can come out of that. Um,
Josh, real quick, you literally read my mind. I had in my notes here. Walter McCarty definitely brings excitement to the program.
yeah, I believe if I remember right, they had a goal, if I recall, within the athletic department. I believe sell 1,000 new season tickets. That was kind of a goal I believe they put out there sometime after Walter McCarty's hiring was announced. And I believe they accomplished that goal that they set out to have a substantial increase in season tickets. So you mentioned Ryan Taylor taking the graduate transfer route to Northwestern. Noah Frederking, a guard that returns for the Aces, averaged 5.4 points per game last season. I think that's a player that you look to increase the scoring load a little bit, and a player that I think can be a bigger contributor this season. You mentioned the addition, Tony, of Shea Feehan from Eureka College. Uh, I'm with you. I think that's a key addition and a guy that can come in and contribute right away. They do have Kansas transfer Sam Cunliffe, who I believe has to sit this season per the transfer rule. Um,
Yes.
the Aces do return two experienced players in the front court in Danis Hatkevicius and Dallin Traore. With Hatkevicius and Traore, both of those players battled some foul trouble throughout last season. And this year with the Aces, it's a front court that doesn't have as much depth when you talk about the transferring out of Drew Smith and Ryan Taylor. So I think this season for Hatkevicius and Traore, it becomes a little bit more paramount, I think, for them to stay out of foul trouble. A couple other things I'm kind of anxious to see with Evansville. Um, Within the guard court, with there being, players with some limited experience returning, I'm really anxious to see who ends up leading this team in scoring when it comes to the backcourt players. Um, I do think there is some question marks in the backcourt, um, but again, really anxious to see who steps up and kind of leads scoring out of that backcourt group. And I'm also very curious to see, what style does Walter McCarty want to play?
Right.
Could is it a bit more of a four guard offense? And a centerman. Um, I think that remains to be seen, and I'll be anxious to see what Walter McCarty's style of play ends up looking like as well.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that Taylor and Smith didn't stick around, because if they did, I think this would have been a pretty interesting team, and a team that could possibly make some noise in this conference. So that was just unfortunate. I get it happens a lot with a coaching change, but I would have liked to see this team with those guys in the lineup.
Oh, absolutely. If if the Aces would still have Taylor and Smith in the mix with the group that's back, um, the Aces predicted 10th. I believe they were predicted to finish last in the preseason poll. If they have Ryan Taylor and Drew Smith back, and if they don't take the graduate transfer route, to me that's an Aces team that would have been predicted much higher. But as you mentioned, graduate transfers and other transfers do happen, and so you play with those that are on your roster, I guess. But again, much like Drake, I think a transition year for the Aces in year one under Walter McCarty.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. All right, so let's move on here. Obviously, we're going to talk about Illinois State next. 18 and 15 last year, 10 and 8 in conference. So outside of Loyola this year, Illinois State seems to be the other team in the league that many are touting as a possible league champ. And they should be, because this is an extremely talented and experienced group that Dan Muller has in Normal. This roster is loaded with seniors, and it all starts with Malik Yarbrough, who I have to say is surprisingly still on the roster. He's gotten into quite a bit of trouble as of late, but he's still there. So that's a good thing for the Redbirds. I love Phil Fain. He took a huge step up last year. Keyshawn Evans is one of the better guards in the conference. He can really shoot it. So they have all the pieces to win this conference. Will it be enough to knock off Loyola? We'll see. But how do you think it plays out this year for the Redbirds, Josh?
Again, a team that's definitely in contention, I think, with Loyola for the league title. Four starters back from last year's team. You mentioned Tony Yarborough, Fain, and Evans. William Tinsley, another starter back from last season that I think will certainly take another step forward this year, and really became one of the go-tos offensively um, for the Redbirds in the second half of the Valley Race, and really had some key baskets at key times in certain games for the Redbirds. Tinsley is a guy that is really known for his 3-point shooting, and that's certainly one of the areas um, that he's helped the Redbirds as well. Um, Other key contributors that came off the bench last year that returned for the Redbirds this season: Taylor Berniga, Matt Hine, and Isaac Gassman. Another interesting wrinkle when you talk about the league title race here, Tony. Illinois State also gains the services. Illinois State also gains the services this season of Loyola transfer Matt Chastain, who sat last season per the transfer rule. Matt Chastain is a guy that I don't know that a whole lot of people are talking about necessarily, but a guy that I think can come in and really help this Redbird team. And then another player that the Redbirds add this season is a junior, Zach Copeland, transfer from City College of San Francisco. And so another player in bold for the Redbirds that I think can help this team. When you talk about the guys off the bench, Taylor Bruniga, Matt Hine, Isaac Gassman, three guys that all had key contributions off the bench throughout last season. When you look at playing time, Taylor Bruniga tend to, I believe, average a bit more minutes when you talk about minutes per game than Hine and Gassman. But really, the contributions of all three of those players, Bruniga, Hine, and Gassman, were all key contributions throughout last season for the Redbirds. The addition of Matt Chastain, I think that helps the Redbirds at both ends of the floor. And I think for the Redbirds to be in the best position to challenge Loyola for the league title. It's important for guys like William Tinsley and Taylor Berniga to increase their scoring and take a step forward.
Right.
I fully expect Matt Hine, Isaac Gassman, Matt Chastain. I look for all those guys to make contributions within their playing time. Illinois State, when you talk about depth in the league, the Redbirds just might have the deepest team in the league, and I think are certainly in
Wow.
position to challenge Loyola for the league title.
Absolutely. You know, I think talent-wise, they might have Loyola-Chicago beat, but the Ramblers possibly might be the better overall team. That'll obviously we'll have to wait and see. But before we move on, Josh, I just wanted to ask you about Malik Yarbrough. How surprised are you that he's still on this roster?
My opinion, somewhat surprised he's still on the roster. More surprised, Tony, the fact that to the knowledge of those of us that cover the Valley throughout the season, that Malik Yarbrough, a player that has had multiple incidents with the law,
Right.
and and to my knowledge, has yet to miss a game. I just I find that very interesting to have multiple run-ins with the law and to my knowledge, not to have missed a game for that reason. Uh, Very interesting to me on that. Am I surprised he's still on the roster? Somewhat, but again, more surprised that to my knowledge he has not missed a game with those multiple run-ins with the law. That's the bigger surprise to me when it comes to that.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Maybe will we possibly see a suspension early on this season? Do you think, or
Um, Again, not something I'm real sure on that. Um,
yeah?
based on him not missing any games previously with the multiple run-ins with the law, I'd be surprised if he misses a game. But that's just my opinion.
Alrighty. All right. So definitely excited about Illinois State. One of the more exciting mid-major teams, one of the better rosters, I think, in the country at that level. So let's move on here. Indiana State is next. 13 and 18 last year. They did go 8 and 10 in the conference. Indiana State is the team I'm pretty intrigued by at first glance. I kind of thought they'd be a bottom tier team. But I think they could possibly maybe climb up in the middle of that pack. Jordan Barnes, I think, is a really talented kid. Tyreek Key is back, who I think could see an expanded role this year. They also have two transfers coming in Cooper Neese and Christian Williams, who will be eligible in the second semester. So they're really going to have one of the deeper backcourts in the conference. The front court, there's definitely some question marks. They do have some solid role players back, so hopefully some of those guys can take another step up and give them more production this year. And if that happens, I think this could be a pretty solid club. How are you feeling about the Sycamores this year, Josh?
Yeah, I think a team that definitely returns, some good pieces. Um, you mentioned the two starters back, Jordan Barnes and Tyreek Key. Um, you also mentioned you took you took the words right out of my notes here with the two transfers and Christian Williams and Cooper Neese eligible at semester. Another player they added via the graduate transfer, Alante Holston, graduate transfer from North Texas. Um, they do return a couple key players in the front court in Amandre Rickman and Bronson Kessinger. Um, Again, two players I think important for them to take a step forward, and I think they will. Um, you really saw Amandre Rickman really improve his play as the season went on last year. Bronson Kessinger, a guy that I think provides Indiana State with some versatility, can play in the paint, has shown the ability to hit some threes on occasion. So Kessinger, I think, provides a lot of versatility for them as well. And again, the addition of Christian Williams and Cooper Neese at semester going into Valley play, again, that's definitely needed depth and important depth for them in the backcourt. I do wonder with the front court situation if we might see Greg Lansing go to a little bit more of a four guard look. Um, I think that's a possibility. Um, and really in an important year, I think, for Indiana State to take another step forward. Um, a team that really did show some positive momentum toward the end of last season. Um, I'll be anxious to see if that continues going into this season. And I do think this is a Sycamore team that may surprise some people, and I do think can take another step forward this season.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. I had Indiana State and Valpo pegged as my, sleeper teams in this conference this year. So I'm right there with you. I think the Sycamores can have a pretty successful year and creep up into that, middle of the pack possibly. I think they could finish even top five if things break right. Would you think that'd be crazy or no?
I'm not sure I see that happening um, given the Illinois schools and what they bring back. But the great thing about the Valley, Tony, is it seems like every year there's a surprise, whether it be where a team finishes in the league race
Right.
or whatever it might be. And so, um, for me, do I think they finish top five? Not necessarily. I think this is probably, at least from a preseason standpoint, um, sixth or seventh place team. But I think if anyone could surprise, if there's a team that could surprise or maybe finish higher than people expect, um, I certainly wouldn't be surprised if the Sycamores finish higher than we're predicted.
Yeah, me too. Totally agree with you. All right, so up next, obviously we have to talk about Loyola-Chicago, coming off a fantastic season, 32 wins, 15-3 in conference, ran away with the conference last year. Great Final Four run, obviously. So Loyola coming off one of the better and more impressive mid-major, seasons of all time, really. And they beat some really good teams in that NCAA tournament. This wasn't some type of fluky NCAA tournament run. Looking ahead to this season, I feel confident they're going to be right in the thick of it again. Outside of Illinois State, who we've talked about earlier tonight, they're probably the favorites to win this league. They do have some pieces to replace. Dante Ingram, Andre Jackson, those are two double-digit scorers. Both of those guys are gone, and I think Ben Richardson might be their biggest loss because he was their glue guy. He was a really good defender. So they definitely have some holes to fill, but you still have a really good core with guys like Clayton Custer, Marcus Towns in that backcourt. You have a very talented big in Cam Krutwig. I think the guy to watch in this roster, Josh, is Lucas Williamson. I thought he played really well in limited minutes last season. He's a talented wing who can really shoot it. I think he's going to see a much bigger expanded role this year. What are your thoughts with the Ramblers?
Well, let me just start with again with Lucas Williamson. You made exactly the point that I was going to mention with him. If you're looking for somebody to kind of take over that Ben Richardson, to use your phrase, a glue guy type role, I think if you're Porter Mosier, I think Lucas Williamson is the player um, to really embrace that role, and I think can really um, can really step into that glue guy type role. Lucas Williamson, a guy that's shown the ability to really hit the three pretty well, uh, played solid defensively last year as well. So I think that's definitely a player that will take another step forward. And another guy to watch off the bench, Bruno Skokna, another player that I think is a key contributor for the Ramblers this season. Uh, you mentioned it, three starters back for the Ramblers. The returning Larry Bird Trophy winner as the MVC Player of the Year, Clayton Custer, Marcus Towns, and Cam Krutwig. And I'd like to kind of move over to Cameron Krutwig for just a moment and
Sure.
make a point about him. Um, Seeing him in person last year, both when the Ramblers came to Cedar Falls and then also covering Arch Madness as well, as I do each year. Um, the thing that really stood out to me, Tony, with Cam Krutwig last year during his freshman season is where his footwork was at for a true freshman. Um, you know, True freshmen contributing in the Valley. It does happen, on a fairly regular basis. But for a front court player like Krutwig to come in and not only contribute at the level he did for this Ramblers team, but where his footwork was last year and how strong it was, that's definitely, to me, what a key part of his success was last season. And there's no reason to think that won't continue this coming season. And then another player that I think the Ramblers and Porter Moser are pretty excited about is the addition of a transfer from New Mexico, Ahir Ugak. And I believe I may have mispronounced his name there, but that's a player coming in as a transfer from New Mexico that I got to believe they'll be counting on to contribute as well. And a player that I think can come in and not only contribute for the Ramblers, but also gives them some additional front court depth to go with Cam Krutwig. One thing with Krutwig last year, there were stretches where he battled a little bit of foul trouble as a true freshman. I'm sure that's something he'll look to get cleaned up heading into this season. But it has to be nice, I would imagine, for Coach Mosier to know that if Krutwig gets in a bit of foul trouble, you have another big off the bench that you can bring in to really fill that role as well. The Ramblers are the preseason pick to win the league. I think they'll have a challenge from both Illinois State and Southern Illinois when you talk about the race for the league title. But I agree with you, Tony. This is a Loyola team that, yes, they lost some pieces, but no reason to think they won't be right back in the mix for the regular season title.
Yeah, I didn't see a ton of Loyola during the regular season, but I obviously watched their run to the Final Four. And Cam Krutwig, as you mentioned, he was fantastic. I thought he was one of the better bigs in the tournament. I'm excited to see him in his second year. I mean, he was so good in year one. I can't imagine what he's going to do this year. They're just a fantastic defensive team, Josh. They're extremely efficient. They're disciplined. They really do everything well, and I just think that's a testament to Porter Moser and what type of coach he is.
Yeah, absolutely. There again, Porter Moser, just like Darren DeVries, who's going into his first year at Drake. Porter Moser, a guy that knows the Valley, was a head coach at Illinois State, played at Creighton during his playing career when Creighton was in the Valley. A guy that knows the Valley, loves it. I think safe to say loves the tradition of the Valley, and just really enjoys, I think, being in this league. Yeah, another great team for Porter. Another great team for Porter Moser this season in Chicago, no question.
Absolutely. I'm picking them to win the league. I went back and forth with Illinois State, but I think you got to go with the champs in Loyola. But should be exciting, and I think they have a great chance to make another run in the NCAA tournament if they can get there. We got to remember last year, if they didn't win that MVC tournament, they probably weren't going to get in.
Yeah, and you go back to the semifinals of Arch Madness. Um, they win, I believe it was a 2-point margin over UNI in the semifinals of Arch Madness. And there was discussion following their semifinal win and then their eventual win in the Arch Madness championship game. There was some discussion, and it's one of those things where as a guy that follows mid-major basketball, covers the Valley, um, there was a lot of talk out there that had Loyola dropped that semifinal game in Arch Madness to UNI, that there is a strong possibility they would not make the tournament.
Very
And
strong.
and while and I will say that is something that I would agree with. Had they lost that game, I'm not sure they make the tournament. Uh, just because of we've seen over the years, and there's plenty of examples when you look at the Missouri Valley Conference in history of teams, whether it be Illinois State from a couple of years ago, Missouri State in the early 2000s under Barry Hinson holds the distinction of the team with the lowest RPI to not make the field with, I believe, a certain number of wins was the criteria that was used. I believe that year with Missouri State in the early 2000s, Missouri State had an RPI of something like, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 to the mid 20s and did not make the field. So yeah, it's history is shown for leagues like the Valley and other mid-major leagues that, unfortunately, a loss by a top seed in a conference tournament can keep you out. Now, um, of course, for a lot of mid-major schools, it would be nice if that would not be the case. But the reality is, with the NCAA tournament selection model being what it is, that's just kind of where that situation is.
Yeah, pretty much. So let's move on here, Josh. Missouri State is next. They finished 18-15 last year, 7-11 in conference. I thought it was a very underachieving type season for Missouri State. As they're the third school, I believe, in conference this year with a new coaching staff. The Paul Lusk era is over, and truthfully, I think that's kind of a good thing for this program. The Bears definitely didn't meet expectations under Lusk, in my opinion. I think they made a great hire in Dana Ford. He takes over. He comes over from Tennessee State, and the cup board isn't totally bare. Let's see here. They have Odabai Church back. He's a solid front court piece. Jared Dixon and Ryan Krecklow in the backcourt. Plus, you have a former four-star recruit and a Xavier transfer, Jared Ritter. I know the coaching staff is excited about him. They also have Josh Webster coming in from Texas Tech. He's another transfer. I'm also hearing some really good things about Keandre Cook, who's a JUCO kid, and the twins there, the Wojcik twins from Poland, are supposed to be pretty darn good as well. So there's definitely some pieces to work with for Coach Ford and this staff. Will it happen in year one? I'm not sure, but definitely some nice things to look forward to. How are you feeling about Missouri State, Josh?
Much like the other two teams we've discussed in Drake and Evansville that have new head coaches, um, again, I think a bit of a transition year again for Missouri State. That said, you mentioned the Bears' new head coach in Dana Ford. Spent the last 4 seasons at Tennessee State, as you mentioned. Dana Ford is a head coach that this guy has won games wherever he has coached. And all you have to do is look back his first 2 seasons at Tennessee State. His first year at Tennessee State is a 5-26 season. He improved that by 15 wins in his second year at Tennessee State. They went 20-11 overall. Now, this Bears team, to me, I think certainly will win. I think more than 5 games overall this season. Um, but I think those numbers from the first 2 years at Tennessee State just show the historical turnarounds that Dana Ford has had as a head coach. And to me, there's no reason that when we're speaking about the Valley this time next year, no reason to think that Dana Ford can't engineer a similar turnaround next season to build off of this year. But you mentioned 2 starters back for the Bears, Obadiah Church and Jared Dixon, returning some key contributors off the bench. Um, the two you mentioned, Ryan Krecklow, Jared Ritter. You mentioned the other transfers that come in this season. Um, the Bears picked 8th in the preseason poll. When you think about what preseason polls are based on, being most largely, the amount of players that a team has back, I think 8th, when you talk about how the preseason poll is set up, that's probably a fair place to rate them. Understanding how most preseason poll voters vote and what most of those voters, take into account. That said, I will not be surprised if the Bears finish perhaps a spot or two higher than 8th. Um, I think seventh. I think 7th is maybe the ceiling for this team this year. But if things break right, again, another team that has potential to finish higher. Um, One thing I'm anxious to look at is if Dana Ford is able to recruit as effectively in Springfield, Missouri, and the surrounding area as he recruited at Tennessee State. To me, there's no reason that year two for him at Missouri State next season, there's no reason to think he won't have the success in year two at Missouri State that he did in year two at Tennessee State. For Missouri State this year, um, I think this is a team that I look for to kind of build momentum and build that chemistry as the season goes. I think they'll have a good first season under Dana Ford, and I won't be surprised if they surprise some people. And frankly, won't be surprised if they win some games in conference play that might raise some eyebrows or be a bit of a surprise just because of the proven quality head coach that Dana Ford is.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the future is definitely bright for Missouri State. I think Dana Ford's a really good coach, and hey, it might not be this year, but I'm sure that program will be turned around very, very quickly. So I'm definitely excited to see what he can do with the program. So moving on here, I have him in the eighth spot as well in my preseason rankings, which, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, for our listeners. I will share my rankings at Josh's once I post the podcast a little later on. So Northern Iowa is up next, coming off a pretty mediocre season for Northern Iowa standards. They finished 16-16. They were 7-11 in conference. This is a tough one for me, Josh, because I'm a really big Ben Jacobson fan. I think he's an excellent basketball coach. But when you look at last year's roster compared to this year's roster, last year's roster was a lot better, in my opinion, and they weren't very good team. So I was really planning on putting the Panthers maybe in the 5 or 6 spot, but I have them at 8. I really just don't. I just don't like what I see on paper. I'm a big Taiwan Pickford guy, but can he be a go-to scorer at the MVC level? I'm not sure. Wyatt Lowhouse is a rock-solid guard, but is he capable of being an impact player on this team? That's another question. They might be relying on freshman AJ Green, who was a highly sought-after recruit. Luckily, his dad was able to sway him to UNI. Kyle Green is the associate head coach. They don't have Bennett Koch. They lose Clint Carlson. They don't have those guys to rely on anymore. So I think it's going to be a pretty down year for UNI. Maybe Ben Jacobson can work some magic, but what do you feel about the UNI Panthers this year?
Well, not to tease too much of my preseason rankings here on the podcast. I know you'll be posting those. Um, this is one spot where I think you mentioned you have UNI eighth in your preseason rankings. I have them in the sixth spot. So that happens to be one spot where there's a bit of a difference of opinion with us that I'm aware of when it comes to the preseason rankings. But a team, Tony, this season with UNI, a team that does return a fair amount of experience from last year's
Mm-hmm.
group. That said, this is a team battling some injuries as we prepare for the start of the regular season. Um, you mentioned sophomore Taiwan Pickford um, had an off-season surgery for an injury. Um, is expected to be cleared here in the near future to begin practice. Remains to be seen yet whether he'll be back for the regular season opener or not. Um, Assuming the recovery goes well and he is cleared in the timeline um, that that has been made known to the media that covers UNI, such as myself. I don't anticipate him um, missing too much time. One thing I will mention here, Tony, for the listeners, just before I go too much further into my discussion into UNI, and that is I do cover the valley as a whole. I do reside in Cedar Falls, Iowa, which is where the University of Northern Iowa is located. So I get a chance to see the Panthers in person in a game in, game out basis. And of course, I watch many other games around the league throughout the season and get a chance to see each of the teams in the league in person once a year with that round robin conference schedule. So just to mention that in the interest of full disclosure as well. Um, Another guy battling some injuries, sophomore interior player Austin Fife is battling a health related situation due to a not battling a health related situation that is not due to any sort of basketball injury. Um, Timeline for his return is a little bit more up in the air and more unknown. Um, has not really been a timeline mentioned as far as when Austin Fife might be available to return to the lineup. But two starters back for you and I this season in Pickford and then also Isaiah Brown. Isaiah Brown, a player that I think is really poised to take a substantial step forward when you talk about offense and defense. He showed his offensive improvement in you and I's exhibition game yesterday, delivered a nice performance. You mentioned the top 100 national recruit from last season in true freshman AJ Green. You mentioned his dad, Kyle Green, the associate head coach. One important thing to mention with the AJ Green signing for you and I, in my opinion, it was not automatic that he would sign with you and I. This is a player that had offers from Power Five conference schools. And so uh, I'm sure certainly Ben Jacobson and associate head coach Kyle Green and that coaching staff, I'm sure certainly happy to add a piece like AJ Green to the roster. But again, I don't think it was necessarily automatic that he would sign with you and I. That said, the coaching staff, I'm sure, is certainly glad that he did. And AJ Green, a true freshman guard. And this is a player, Tony, that Ben Jacobson said at Media Day a few weeks ago. AJ gets the keys to the Cadillac from game one. Started at guard yesterday. He's expected to start game one of the regular season as well. And this is a guy that uh, is very skilled offensively, has a very high release and a high arc on his shot that really makes it a little bit difficult for defenders to block, and just has a lot of strong skill sets offensively. Comes in with a pretty strong defensive skill set, but I think AJ would tell you, and the coaching staff would tell you, as a true freshman, there's certainly some areas to work on and build on. But AJ is a player I do think they will look to get some contributions from throughout the season. You mentioned Wyatt Lowhouse, a guy that battled some injuries last year. And frankly, Tony, Wyatt Lowhouse, I'm not sure was ever fully healthy last season. Um, even when he did play after missing some time, you know, if you talk to, myself or other media that cover you and I, or that cover the league for that matter, and I think they would acknowledge the same thing. When he returned from missing some games, he was back in the lineup, but again, I don't think 100% healthy. Um, Covering their exhibition game yesterday, he certainly looks back 100% health wise, and I think is really primed to play a key role this year with this team. I will say it remains to be seen whether he will start or come off the bench. Um, Certainly showed his skill as a six man last year, but it'll be anxious to me to see whether he starts or comes off the bench. The Panthers also gained the services of Pepperdine transfer Trey Burhow and also added junior college transfer an interior player and Shandon. His nickname, from what I'm told, is Biggie. Shandon Biggie Goldman joins the Panther front court this season and is expected to play a key role as well. Really, Goldman is kind of your prototypical stretch 4 or 5. Can show the ability to play in the paint, but also is a guy that's not afraid to step outside that 3-point arc, and he can hit the three as well. Um, One player from recent UNI history that he reminds me of in some ways to an extent is, if you recall, former UNI Panther Seth Tuttle. Um, the 3-point range for Goldman kind of reminds me a little bit um, of Seth Tuttle. Expect UNI to play a 4-guard lineup this season. The other thing is, expect them to really look to push the pace in transition with their depth in the guard court. The biggest question mark to me for UNI is in the rebounding department, but I look for them to have another solid season.
All right, I'm a little bit leery. I think you feel a lot better about the Panthers than I do, as I said. So we'll see what happens. Like again, Ben Jacobson, one of the better coaches in the conference, so wouldn't be shocked if they finish a few spots higher where I have them. So should be fun. So the
Hey,
next team we're going to talk about,
Tony,
Southern.
just real
Yeah,
quick, can I just get like a minute or two break to run and use the restroom? I'll be back. That work?
sure,
Okay.
no problem. I got some things to plug anyway, so
Okay, 1 second.
thanks. While Josh takes a quick break, guys, I just have a lot of things coming up this week that I can talk about now instead of at the end of the podcast. We have a lot of great interviews coming up this week, and we have a few more previews just to let you know. I believe on Wednesday, we're going to be doing the Big Ten preview with Kevin Sweeney from CBB Central. On Thursday, we're going to be doing the Big 12 preview with Eric Fawcett from GatorCountry.com. Excited to have Eric on the podcast again. He's been on a few times. I'm sure you're familiar with both Kevin and Eric. And I also have some really interesting guests coming up. Tomorrow, Andy Bottoms is coming on from assemblycall.com to talk about the Indiana Hoosiers. He covers the team. He covers the Big Ten. He's also a bracketologist. So I'm really excited to talk to him. And also, we have some coaches coming on this week as well. On Wednesday night, we have Craig Smith, Utah State head coach. We'll be talking about the Aggies and hopefully some Mountain West talk as well. And then another discussion I haven't set up schedule-wise yet, but we're going to be talking to Ross Hodge from North Texas, assistant coach. The Mean Green are one of the more intriguing teams in the CUSA this year. So that's going to be really exciting. I'm actually looking forward to that because I'm very high on North Texas this year. And we have some other ones sprinkled in as well. I have a big-time guest coming on Friday. I'm not going to announce that just quite yet. But it should be fun. The season's right around the corner, so I'm trying to fit in a lot of different things. But again, so tomorrow's schedule, Andy Bottoms from assemblycall.com will be on just for a quick 10 to 15-minute discussion. Indiana's a team that I think a lot of people are intrigued with, obviously with Romeo Langford coming in and Jawan Morgan returning. So that'll be tomorrow night. I will post that on Twitter. So is Josh back?
Yes.
All right, great. Here we go, Josh. So this is the team that I really want to get your in-depth thoughts on because I think Southern Illinois is probably the team I'm most excited about coming into this season. I feel like the Salukis are kind of the forgotten team of the offseason. You know, it seems like everybody's focused on Loyola, obviously, after last year's great run. Illinois State has a ton of talent coming back. You know, and there sits Southern Illinois, who won 20 games last year. They finished in second place. They bring back all 5 starters that I believe you mentioned in your MVC outlook at the start. Plus, you add a thick Bowl who missed last year with a knee injury. He's one of the better players in the conference. So this is a team that's really scary, and I would not be shocked at all if they're in the mix for the conference title. What are your overall thoughts on the Salukis, Josh?
Well, I'll start with, to me, Southern Illinois, the best front court depth in the Valley, in my opinion. You mentioned the Salukis get Teak Bowl back, who missed last season due to an injury, and another guy, senior Kevion Pippen, a guy that I think is really poised to take another big step forward this season. Kevion Pippen is a player that, you could see as the season went on last year, just playing better and better as the year went on. And I really think when you put Kevion Pippen together with Teak Bowl, That's easily, to me, the best front court tandem in the league and might be one of the better front court tandems amongst mid-major schools. Um, you, um, we mentioned earlier all five starters back for the Salukis. Five of their six top scorers from last season's team back. Um, they also get back junior Eric McGill, um, who missed a number of games last season due to an injury. And I think if Eric McGill can stay healthy, um, he's another key contributor, I think, for SIU this season. Um, Armand Fletcher returns for Southern Illinois, who was a preseason all-conference selection, I believe. Um, Sean Lloyd is back as well. Marcus Bartley, just a number of talented players for the Salukis back. In my mind, Tony, Southern Illinois and Valpo are the two teams in the league that, to me, nobody is talking about that I think are primed for some really strong seasons. I have the Salukis actually finishing second in my power rankings. Believe it or not, it's I'm really anxious to see what this Saluki team can do. And looking at the preseason poll, if you notice, the Salukis received one first place vote in the poll. That first place vote that the Salukis received in the preseason poll came from none other than their head coach, Barry Hinson. So that tells you right there, Coach Hinson, I think, is certainly excited about this returning group that he has. And I look for the Salukis to surprise some people this season. I've got them second in my preseason power rankings.
Yeah, and that's not a crazy pick at all. I love Barry Hinson. I think he's one of the more underrated coaches in the country. I love their depth up front, as you mentioned. They have a lot of size. They have solid guards. They don't really have a lot of holes. I mean, they really don't. It's tough to find holes on this roster. So I have them at 3. But I wouldn't be shocked if they're in that top 2
Well,
when things finish up.
and one thing with Southern Illinois, the Salukis may have, when you talk about quality depth, another thing I think the Salukis challenge Loyola with. Certainly, the Ramblers have great depth, but Southern Illinois' depth, to me, is just as good, if not maybe better, than Loyola's.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I think we can say clear cut that Loyola, Illinois State, and Southern Illinois are the cream of the crop in this league and the top 3 teams in the conference heading into the season next week. So I'm very excited about the Salukis. I hope they have a great season, and don't be shocked if they win the league. I really believe that. I think they have that much talent. So the other team that Josh is excited about, and we're going to finish up with in our team previews tonight, obviously, is Valparaiso. 15 and 17 last year, 6 and 12. So it was the first year for Valpo in the MVC. Didn't go well. They had some issues with injuries. They also had some suspension issues, stuff like that. So just seemed like the team never really clicked. I think this year they can start fresh with a solid returning core. I think they have 3 starters back, led by Bakari Evelyn. He's a really solid guard, and a kid that I really like is Marcus Golder. I think he's going to take a big step up this year and maybe be the breakout guy in this league. He should slide into that starting lineup. He can really shoot the basketball. And they have some interesting newcomers. Ryan Physique is a transfer from Ryan Physique, excuse me, is a transfer from Providence. He's definitely going to be helping out in that backcourt. And also Javon Freeman, I believe his name is. I think he's a pretty highly touted recruit out of Chicago. I think this roster is a little bit more balanced than they were last year, so I think they can make a little bit of noise. I don't know if I'm as high as Valpo as you are, Josh, but I definitely think they're going to be creeping up the standings this year. How do you feel about the Crusaders?
The Crusaders returned their 2 big men in Derek Smits and Jay Soroya. Um, Smits and Soroya did last season battle a little bit of foul trouble in certain games. Um, Valpo lost their point guard, Tavon Walker, due to graduation. Um, you mentioned the Crusaders gained the services of the Providence transfer redshirt junior Ryan Fazekas. They also add graduate transfer Dion Lavender. Dion Lavender spent time at Southern Illinois previously, so a guy that knows the league. Um, you mentioned the key returnees in the backcourt, Bakari Evelyn, Micah Bradford, and Marcus Golder. And again, it's interesting. You mentioned something that I had in my notes here once again. To me, Marcus Golder, the most underrated returning player in the Valley going into this season, in my opinion. I think you're spot on, Tony, with what you mentioned that he is a player that's primed to take a step forward. And I would say the same thing about Bakari Evelyn and Micah Bradford as well. That's another two guys that really improved as the season went on. And, again, I think all three of those guys are primed for big years. Um, Ryan Fazekas um, can help, I think can help fill some holes perhaps in that front court as well. Um, if it's a situation where one of the players between Derek Smits and Jay Soroya is on the floor. Quite often they'll play with both those guys in the game together. But I think you could see perhaps Ryan Fazekas at the four. If it's just one of the two, Smith or Soroya on the floor at that point. But yeah, I think anytime you transition conferences, there's an adjustment period. Um, again, last year, I'm sure not the year that Valpo wanted with year one in the league. But I think this is a Crusaders team that, again, has a lot of quality depth and primed to take a big step forward.
Yeah, you're right. And as I mentioned earlier, I think they just had a lot of distractions last year and injuries. So I think they're in a lot better shape to compete with the top half of the league this year. It'll
Yeah,
be interesting to see. And I think Valpo is one of the more consistent mid-major programs, and I think they're going to do fine in the MVC. It
yeah,
might take another year or two to get near the top of the league, if they can get their recruiting up. But I definitely think they're going to be very competitive this year, and it wouldn't shock me if they're in that middle of the pack.
yeah. And you mentioned some of the distractions last year, losing Joe Burton due to some academic issues. Um, you look at Valpo, picked seventh in the preseason poll, but to me, there's talent there for Valpo to finish in the top six if things fall right and they get off to a good start in the league.
Absolutely. I like Matt Lodich too. I think he's a really solid basketball coach. So I'm pulling for the Crusaders. I've always liked that program, and they're definitely, I think, going to be on the rise this year. So, all right, so that's going to do it with our team previews. A lot of great information tonight. I'm very excited that Josh was able to come on. Before we finish up here, we're just going to have some fun. We're going to do some picks. So, all right, Player of the Year, Josh. Who are you going with? There's two guys I think you have to key in on, obviously, is Clayton Custer and Malik Yarbrough. I lean Clayton Custer because I think Loyola is going to win the league again, but Yarbrough is an absolute stat stuffer. But Custer gets it with Loyola winning the league for their second straight year. What are you thinking about for your Player of the Year pick?
I'm with you on Player of the Year. Clayton Custer repeats as Player of the Year. We agree.
All right. And breakout, I think we're on the same page there as well. Marcus Golder, I'm very excited about. But another kid that we both were on the same page with as well, I think it has to be in the mix is Lucas Williamson at Loyola. What are you thinking for a breakout player? Sorry.
Breakout players, absolutely. Golder from Valparaiso, Lucas Williamson at Loyola. Um, I think both of those players are um, certainly important to mention when you talk about breakout players. Um, I'll mention another one, um, Kavion Pippin, Southern Illinois. Um, I think he could surprise some people this year. When you talk about, I think an increase in scoring, and I think he'll rebound the ball better. I think that's another player to watch. Um, One other one that I would throw in the mix, and it's maybe one that maybe people wouldn't think about. But I really look for Brady Ellingson at Drake. Graduate transfer coming in from Iowa, showed showed a lot of offensive skill, um, scoring the ball at Iowa in his minutes he played there. Um, didn't necessarily play a huge amount of minutes last year for the Hawkeyes, but I wouldn't be surprised if Brady Ellingson at Drake has a bit better year than some might predict.
Oh, I'm with you. I think Ellingson, and Norton are some really sneaky grad transfer pickups. I think both of those guys make a huge impact in this league. And finally, newcomer of the year. I think you have to go with Green at Northern Iowa, just based on his recruiting ranking and all that. There's really not a ton of high level recruits coming in this year in the conference. I think another guy that I've heard a lot of good things about that could kind of sneak up on people is Keandre Cook, the JUCO transfer at Missouri State. But I think Green is the pick.
Newcomer of the year, when you talk about that in the preseason, always a little bit of a tough call
Sure.
just because these newcomers have not played a game yet in the league. Um, it's no secret. Those that follow college basketball and that follow the Valley, probably know a little bit of the story of the recruitment process for AJ Green, eventually signed with Northern Iowa. But as I mentioned before, had some Power Five offers. So again, that was a question that I got quite a bit prior to AJ Green signing. People would ask me, that have questions about the league. Do you think AJ signs with you and I? And I think Tony, if you ask Northern Iowa fans, um, around the Cedar Valley area, they would probably all tell you that it was automatic that he would sign with you and I.
Mm-hmm.
But again, fans look at it from the fan standpoint. Obviously, as we've talked about, there's a connection there with his father, Kyle Green, the associate head coach at UNI. But again, this is a guy that had Power Five opportunities. Um, and so, as we've discussed, I think he will play an important role for UNI this year. With the Newcomer of the Year award in the Valley, it's not something that you typically always see go to freshmen. Um, but um, but to your point, I think AJ Green is certainly, maybe in the conversation for that come postseason awards time. But as far as a pick for Newcomer of the Year currently, not something I have a real good handle on just yet prior to the start of the season.
Of course, it's a tough call, but it's definitely fun to make these picks. So, all right, so that's going to wrap it up for the MVC preview tonight. Josh, you were an excellent guest. A lot of great information. I really appreciate you coming on. Again, you guys can follow Josh Betts at Betts Sports Beat on Twitter, and his website is bettsportsbeat.com. So definitely check Josh out on Twitter and definitely check out his website. Josh, thank you so much for joining tonight. It was great.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. And I would just mention you mentioned the website there. Um, as we start the college hoop season here in about a week, um, there'll certainly be some content on there. So definitely would. I really enjoy interacting with college basketball fans and sports fans on Twitter. So definitely feel free to give me a follow if your listeners wish. And again, just want to give you a tip of the cap, Tony, for the work you're doing. Um, pretty impressive. Speaking as a fellow independent writer, podcaster, the work you're doing is definitely something on a personal note that I admire and look up to, and I certainly look forward to um, continuing to promote each other's work. I hope as the season gets underway, and I look forward to working with you and talking college basketball as the year goes on as well. But I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. It was great to talk with you tonight.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely have you back for one of our weekly recap episodes during the season. So love to talk to you again. Thank you so much, Josh. And we will be back, as I said, guys, tomorrow night. Andy Bottoms from assemblycall.com will be joining me just for a few minutes. We're going to talk some Indiana Hoosier hoops and some Big Ten, so that should be fun. And like I said during our break, a lot of previews coming up this week, a lot of great guest spots. So look forward to that, and we will post the podcast in just a few minutes here, along with both of our projections on our rankings. So thanks so much, and we'll talk to you later.